So if you pull through from the unhealthy state to the healthy state, you've made it, you've recovered. Hi. Why should we use phrasal verbs when they're not necessarily shorter than the verbs that they substitute? And when is it best not to use phrasal verbs? So if you want to know how to best communicate in English, carry on watching. This is Susan Broder from Speak Languages and Travel the World, here to help you improve your English with minimum effort and maximum benefit. Now, I was discussing phrasal verbs with a student of mine a few days ago because he was wondering why we're using such difficult phrasal verbs when the verbs that they substitute are actually shorter or easier than the phrasal verbs themselves. And that started me thinking, because of course phrasal verbs are very difficult for students to use. But if you use the original words, the original verbs, you just speak correctly, but you don't sound natural. So, for example, if you've eaten too much chocolate and so your weight has increased, you could use the correct verb and say, "Oh, I've gained a kilo this week. I must be careful and diet a little." But no person would actually say, "I've gained a kilo" in natural, spontaneous English. We'd all use the phrasal verb, "I've put on a kilo." So even if gain is the right word and it's shorter, put on is the word we'd use. So you can say, "I've gained a kilo," and we'll all understand you. But if you say, "I've put on a kilo," you'll sound very native, you'll sound very natural. And now it's not important to necessarily sound native, but it is important to sound natural. In my video regarding health, I realized that the phrasal verbs are much more elaborate than, for example, in my video regarding travel. If you haven't seen them, check them both out. One is here and the other one too. What's the difference between using the actual dedicated verb compared to using the phrasal verb? Let's take the example of, I'm terribly sorry, I'm in the countryside and over here now we have agricultural machinery working. On the other side there are some goats. Well, that's what makes life more interesting, I suppose. In any case, the phrasal verbs regarding health are the typical example of verbs which are very, very visual. You can visualize what it means. So, for example, if a person is quite seriously ill, you could use the dedicated verb recover. He became healthy again. He recovered from his serious illness. But recover again is not a very visual word. We would much rather use he pulled through. Now, pull is something difficult to do. You pull. And if you have to go through a tight space, such as a tunnel, you have difficulty pulling through the tunnel. And on one side of the tunnel, you have the illness that may lead, for example, to death or to serious consequences. On the other side of the tunnel, you have a healthy environment. So if you pull through from the unhealthy state to the healthy state, you've made it, you've recovered. So pull through refers to the difficulty of recovering, and it's something very, very visual. So phrasal verbs are often visual. They give you an image of the situation. If I said he recovered, it doesn't give the same intensity of seriousness from the bad to the good. Instead, we can say he pulled through. It means he really survived. This is a typical example of when phrasal verbs are better than using the dedicated verb. Another example is to bring on. Bring on, in the case of health, means that something is caused by something else. For example, the illness was brought on by a virus. Now, you can imagine that, for example, a child with some typical children's illness comes to your house and he passes this illness from him to your children. So we could say it was literally brought by the boy to infect your child. The illness was brought on by a virus that the visiting child accidentally passed to the healthy child. So you can say, my son's illness was brought on by a virus that a friend of his had, so he caught it. It's very different from saying his illness was caused by a virus, because somehow it's not as visual. You don't have the feeling of having it brought. So I would say that using phrasal verbs gives more color and more visual, more intense meaning to what you're saying, rather than the dedicated verbs. A last example regarding this topic is the expression to pass away. Now, obviously, if you are working in the medical environment, you can say a person died. But if you want to then explain to the relatives that this person died, it's quite brutal. It's much nicer to say he passed away. He passed from living on to death. And this passage is very evident with the expression he passed away, and it's a softer, more delicate way of saying it, that I'm sorry the patient died. It's much better to say I'm sorry he passed away. So I would definitely recommend using phrasal verbs when you want to give intensity to what you want to communicate. On the other hand, it really depends on who you communicate with, whether it's a good idea to use phrasal verbs at all or not. There are many situations where you're communicating with foreigners at a conference, or you're writing a paper which will be mostly read by foreigners. For example, if you're studying at a university which offers a course in English, but you're in a foreign country, the professors will probably not be native speakers of English, but they'll need to correct your thesis. And if you make it too complicated, they'll have trouble understanding it. So when you're speaking to foreigners, it would be better to simplify and not use very complicated expressions, because the first objective of speaking English is to communicate, and subsequently to communicate using colorful language such as phrasal verbs. In my opinion, the most important factor for foreigners to learn phrasal verbs in English is to make it part of your passive language, your passive vocabulary. You have to be able to understand all the phrasal verbs, at least all the most common phrasal verbs, which people will be using, so that you can interact with people and understand them. This doesn't mean that you need to use the phrasal verbs as part of your active language. You need to have a very large passive vocabulary, which will include a lot of phrasal verbs, but then you can just pick and choose the few phrasal verbs that you find easiest to implement, and those are the ones that you can use when speaking. But be careful who you're speaking to, because if you're speaking to foreigners, they may not always be appropriate depending on the context. You need to make sure that when you're communicating, the ideas you communicate are the most important thing. If you can't get the idea across to someone else because you're making it all flowery with all your phrasal verbs, there's no point in it. You need to absolutely communicate first, and then if you're speaking to a native speaker, you can also decorate it with fancy phrasal verbs. Otherwise, keep it simple. So I hope this has clarified why it's important to learn phrasal verbs and when it's important not to use them. Make sure you have fun learning phrasal verbs. The best way to do it is in context, and for that you can check out my phrasal verbs in context playlist, which is up here. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe and don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you can be notified of any new videos I upload. Meanwhile, make sure you have lots of fun learning English, because it's only when you're having fun that you really learn. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye!